So one of the reasons we wanted to have this discussion today is overwhelmingly, despair can take over when you start thinking about large global issues. When there's problems, whether it be climate change, poverty, all sorts of issues, they seem so large that it's hard to take action and take control over a piece maybe that we can be a part of. So what we wanted to do with this discussion today is bring together several folks who have very different perspectives and backgrounds in their lives, but we brought them here today to come together and talk about climate change and talk about positive, empowering actions and how we can all take action and turn something that seems like such an overwhelming problem and break it down into pieces that we can take part in. So to give a little bit of preface to the discussion, we thought it would be important to at least do a short overview of just some basic points about climate change. So not a long lecture, no worries. But this way we all have the same background information going forward today. If we're thinking about what's happening in the world, there are indicators that scientists can take a look at to tell us what's happening in terms of global climate. And this 10 indicators of a warming world actually highlights the main components that are being studied in looking at what's happening with the climate of our planet. So indicators of a warming world would be increases, of course, in temperature, but that's not just temperature over land, that's temperature over the oceans, as well as the temperature in the ocean. It would be the amount of water vapor that is in the atmosphere. It would be the amount of glacial ice and ice sheets, the amount of snow cover that's available, as well as the overall ocean heat content, not just the sea surface temperature. So in a warming world, all of those things would be increasing. The one thing that would be decreasing is the amount of sea ice and the overall mass of the glaciers and ice sheets and snow cover, particularly in the cryosphere, so in the Arctic regions of the planet. The one indicator that you probably hear the most about is the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. So we've been monitoring CO2 in the atmosphere consistently at the Mauna Loa research station in Hawaii since 1958, I believe, was the first year of data. And this is a recent graph. So this goes up until, I think I pulled this graph off of their website a few days ago. And what you see when you look at this graph of CO2 concentration is what? What do you see? Okay, it's going up. So what does this mean? Well, if we graph CO2 content going back much further in history, so a longer record, and the way we do that, clearly we did not have CO2 recording stations in 200,000 years ago. However, we have a really excellent way to find out what the atmospheric concentration was 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 years ago, and that is through ice cores. So as water freezes, the gases that are in the air are captured and frozen in time. So in our polar regions, where we have consistent freezing over hundreds of thousands of years, when you core down and you take those cores and then take them back, actually right over here at the Federal Center, the ice core lab here does a lot of this analysis. You can extract the atmosphere that's trapped in that ice, and you can figure out what the concentration of CO2 was. So when we do that and we map that all the way back, you can see where we are today on the left right there is much higher than any time in the last 450,000 years. Okay. And then if you look at just the last few years and you look at this graph, you see a lot of variation, right? But it's a regular pattern. So what this indicates is the amount of CO2 in the air does vary with the seasons. However, the overall trend that we see is that it is still increasing. So last September, we were at 405 parts per million. This September, we're at 408 parts per million. And you can actually just track that back. All of this is available. You can go to NOAA's website and you can pull up this graph yourself and you can play with the data. It's actually an interactive graph and you can move it around and it'll tell you what all the values are. And it's not just CO2 that is increasing. There are many gases that we track that are increasing, and that includes CFCs, nitrous oxides, as well as water vapor, actually. And all of these act to trap heat in our atmosphere. Okay. Now, why is this of concern? Well, it's probably of concern for a lot of reasons, but there's some very practical reasons why climate is important to pay attention to, and that is in terms of society. We are all living here on this planet, and the impact of a changing climate often is that there are changes in the way that weather patterns behave. So weather and climate, those are two different things. Weather is local. Weather is something that, like today, it's nice and sunny outside, and maybe, last Thursday it was snowing, right? Those are weather patterns. But the fluctuations in those weather patterns is what is being tracked as far as tracking it to climate change effects. So if we just take a look, in 2019 so far, we have had, 10 weather and climate related disasters that costs over $1 billion. Okay, so there is one reason right there. People's lives are affected, their livelihoods are affected, and where they live is being affected. So we may see stronger hurricanes. We may see longer drought cycles, longer or bigger floods. That's one we've seen a lot recently, actually. But if you go back over the last 2 decades, what you see is an increase in all of these things. So again, all of this data is available if you go to NOAA's website, and each month, they give a summary of climate-related disasters and significant climate anomaly events. The other thing that is tracked and reported monthly is temperature, so not just for the United States, but also global. And we also look at precipitation. So you can go back through all of the archives of this, and you can actually look maybe from September to September or October to October over 2 decades, and you can see the trends and the patterns that are happening. And then, of course, you can do this for global as well. Now, one thing that is often brought up as a talking point is, well, maybe it's just because the sun's energy is getting bigger. Well, the sun's energy is not. The sun's energy is also being tracked. And in this graph here at the bottom there, you can see the sun's energy does vary. It has a sinusoidal pattern, so it rises and falls and over about an 11-year cycle. But if you compare a section of looking at the sun's energy output with the global surface temperature, there is no correlation between the increase in surface temperatures because the variation in the sun's output has not increased. Summer sea ice extent. Again, this is something that has been in the news recently as well. September is when the northern sea ice extent usually is at its smallest, and once again, it was at the smallest that it has been. And Greenland has alarming changes in its ice mass, and there are many glaciers and ice sheets that are melting at faster and faster rates. So if you take a look at time-lapse images of sea ice, you can see that. It's very easy to track from, again, September to September and see those decreases. And all of that melting, well, there's impact of that as well, and that leads to sea level rise. It's not just the melting that causes that. It is actually the increase in the ocean temperature causes the actual mass of the ocean to but the volume to expand because it's warmer. Now, this is the big issue that often gets debated. Is this human-induced, or is it just natural? Well, climate scientists have been looking at this for quite a long time, and what you do to try to tease this apart is you do climate modeling. There are a lot of ways to do climate modeling, and this problem has been looked at in a lot of different ways, and if you run models with natural forces in place, you cannot match the amount of warming that we're seeing. The only way to match modeling-wise the amount of warming we're seeing is to include the human-induced factors. So there have been many models that have been run for different parts of the world, and they all indicate the same thing. The only way to match what we're seeing is to include human-induced effects. So where are we going to be? If we're looking at this long record of CO2 and we're seeing where we are now, which is well over 400 parts per million, what happens in the end, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, really depends on us. So where will we be in the emissions scenario? Will our emissions just keep going up? And if so, we're going to have to deal with the outcome of that. And if we keep our emissions steady or decrease our emissions, then that creates some other opportunities for us. Okay, so with that introduction to the climate problem, I would like to have each of our panelists introduce themselves, and then we're going to allow each panelist to give us a little bit more about their perspective on the issue of climate and taking action on climate. And my name is Barbra Sobhani, and I'm going to be your moderator. I am the director of the Trefny Honors Program at Red Rocks Community College, and I teach a lot of classes around these topics. So the topic is near and dear to my heart. So we'll start with Lloyd. Lloyd, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Lloyd Burton, and I'm a professor emeritus of law and public policy at the School of Public Affairs at the University of Colorado at Denver. And I founded our graduate program in environmental law and policy there. Emeritus is a fancy term for retired, with a pat on the head. And so since then, I've been serving. I was the founding leader of the Colorado Sierra Club's issue team on environmental justice and social equity, and participated in some environmental litigation trying to prohibit the widening of I-70, for instance, through some environmental justice neighborhoods. I also serve as the guiding teacher and environmental chaplain for the Insight Meditation Community of Denver, which is a Theravada Buddhist meditation group. A few weeks ago, there was an article in the New Yorker magazine by a novelist named Michael Franzen, and it basically was capitulating the apocalypse. It was, the rap from the fossil fuel industry for some time now has been, well, this isn't really a big deal, and besides, there's nothing you can do about it. His article was more to the effect of, this is a really big deal, and we're all doomed, and there's nothing you can do about it. A friend of mine and a fellow Dharma teacher who is an environmental, atmospheric scientist for the Environmental Defense Fund, said that he did a tremendous disservice in that article. And so did the New Yorker, and she really wished they had some kind of science advisory board because he just got the science flat wrong. Because he was talking about there's this looming trigger point after which we're all doomed, and that's going to be it, and therefore he's wallowing in his own despair and he's tending his own garden like Pangloss, and that's it. She said there's actually about 35 or 40 trigger points. And the more effort we put in now to doing everything possible to halt climate change, the less suffering there's going to be for those yet to come. And so based on that, I decided that I wanted to look back into history in order to suggest some ways we can better care for the future. When Greta Thunberg was talking to the UN Climate Summit, she said, you speak of money and of fantasies and fairy tales of unlimited economic growth while we are on the verge of mass extinction. You're robbing my generation of our future on this earth. How dare you, right? So, how do we come to care as much for those yet to come as we do for ourselves? Happily, in this time and place, we have historical precedent to which to look. My first two books were about the rights, the environmental rights, or in some cases the lack thereof, of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. So what I'll be talking about, I'll be conveying academic knowledge about that subject. Happily, we have Nicole here, who is going to be able to share some traditional cultural knowledge and the value structure of her people, on the same topic. My tribe is the Celtic Welsh. We built Stonehenge, Her ancestors built, Machu Picchu, Chichen Itza, Temple of the Sun, Temple of the Moon, Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, thousands of other sites here. Prior to, the recent research tells us that prior to the first European contact, there were over 100 million indigenous peoples living in the Americas, including 10 million here in the current day United States. So there's a great deal to be learned about what their experience was. Specifically, the case I want to refer to is the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. It was existed in upstate New York, lower New England. It came into being about 1400 around there, given their oral tradition. Originally 5 tribes, Cayuga, Mohawk, Onondaga, Oneida, and Seneca. They had been in conflict with each other for a very long time, because when they were hunting in their own grounds and they overfished or overhunted or harvested too much food from their own hunting grounds, they'd move into those or invade those of their neighbors. And it led to a lot of conflict over a long period of time. And finally, there was this realization that this was no way to live a life. All of those tribes are matriarchal. So the matriarchs of each of those tribes chose a peacemaker, a senior male member of the tribe, and they were charged to come together in council and to create an agreement amongst all the tribes that would bring all this conflict to an end. Okay. They realized that the reason they were having the conflicts they were is because they were overhunting and overfishing and overgathering on their own lands, and that led them to invade others. And so eventually a colonist, because this was a durable intertribal governmental structure that was in place when the British colonies were first founded, and a colonist who wrote down their principles of council into the form of a constitution, in the first clause of that, what they pledge one to another is to manage their own resource base sustainably, so there would be no need for conflict to arise, so that they could trade, or they could just generously give to a tribe that was down on its luck, periodically. But the idea was they understood that it was their inability to sustainably manage the resource base that was causing the conflict. And so they came into an agreement for how to do that. And the charge to them from their matriarchs and in the first clause of their constitution said, you must develop a hide that has the toughness of 7. What that has generally been interpreted to mean is that there's going to be a lot of pressure on you to make deals only for the well-being of the current generation. But you have to think about the 3 generations before us, the elders who sustainably managed the resource base so that we could be here and live well. And you likewise must think about the generations yet to come, because you owe that to them in the same way that the elders owed that to us, that you have to keep the faith going forward. Okay. How do we do that in this time and place? Well, the next generation nailed it for us. You know, Greta said fantasies and fairy tales of endless economic development, right? It is fossil fuel-based energy systems that are fueling the global economy as well as our own. Okay. It is the global flow of capital that fuels those energy systems. So if we're going to effect the kinds of changes that need to be made, we know it's not going to come from above anytime soon, right? It's going to come from individual decisions that we make. And we can do things like try to get more fuel-efficient cars and whatnot, but the real source of the flow of the problem is the flow of capital. And the biggest banks in the country are the ones that are killing us off. Chase and J.P. Morgan and the others, also the insurance companies. So there are things that we can be doing right now in terms of to the degree to which we control the flow of any capital at all, in terms of where we bank. For instance, that can begin to change that. Find out whether the lending institution that you do business with helps fuel the fossil fuel industry. If it does, find another one. Okay. I don't know if our CPA friend is going to come down on the same side of that, but it means that we have to be ready to take something of a hit. And I'm blessed to have some funds to invest. And when we sat down with our, a few years ago now it was, with our own counselor and said, you know, we need to get out of fossil fuels. We need to do it right now. She said, you're going to take a huge hit. And we said, that's, yeah, right. We're all going to have to take a hit for this to come out right. And so we did. 6 months later, the fossil fuel industry cratered. And we actually wound up saving, you know, a bunch of money because we did the right thing just because we wanted to do the right thing. So those are individual things that we can do. You know, the reason I talk about the Haudenosaunee is because Benjamin Franklin did. In the 1750s, he was doing a lot of negotiating with the tribes, and the colonists were at each other's throats. They were passing tariffs against each other and whatnot, had no capacity for mutual self-protection. He said, we call these people savages, but look what they've done. They've put together an intertribal governance structure that covers hundreds of miles. It requires no policing. They provide for their mutual defense. And the Haudenosaunee actually told the English, it said, you really need to get your act together because our enemies up in Canada are tight with the French and they're getting ready to put the hammer down on you. And if you don't come together, you're going to lose to the Canadians, you know, to the French. So they were instrumental in Franklin's Albany Plan of Union. He said, this is the model. This is the way forward for us. And it wasn't until almost a generation later that we actually kind of caught on and started doing that. But the lessons from the Haudenosaunee are every bit as crucial now as they were then. Okay. Finally, one of the things I do as an environmental chaplain is to, I teach a secular version of mindfulness meditation to environmental caregivers, just like burnout is a perpetual problem with healthcare providers. Same thing is true of environmental care providers, whether it's wildland firefighters or people that work in the Sierra Club and Conservation Colorado and whatnot. So I'm actually teaching a mindfulness meditation course for them. The classic symptoms of burnout are, number one, a sense of overwhelm. Secondly, a sense of isolation. I'm in this alone. What can I do alone? Thirdly, a sense of not being appreciated or recognized for the values that you hold. Okay. So for us going forward, a lot of us feel the same stuff. And there are things that we can do to help turn that around. Number one, with regard to the sense of overwhelm, don't buy into the despairing rhetoric. Number one, it's not true any more than denialist rhetoric is. Secondly, it's profoundly disempowering. Okay. Secondly, don't try to go it alone. Find others who agree with you. Find organizations of people who share your values that you can work with, whatever form of organization you find that to be. And thirdly, recognize that this is our work. This is our work on behalf of those who yet to come. You know, if we're not part of the solution, we're part of the problem. You know, if you think of the Gaia perspective of the Earth as one great single organism of which we are mere cells, okay, right now we are involuntary pathogens, right, because of our reliance on fossil fuel systems. What does a mammalian body do when it's afflicted with pathogens? One of its strategies is to run a fever. And the idea behind running a fever is to drive the temperature up high enough to kill off the pathogen without killing the host. And unfortunately, given our situation as pathogens, we're in the process of doing that. However, we also spend some of our time as antibodies, as those who are trying to heal this affliction and make it better. So for us, each of us, and collectively, to say, okay, how much of my time am I spending as a pathogen, or my time or my wealth, or what, and how much am I spending as an antibody, and to do everything, and to collectively do what we can to change that ratio. Okay, so thank you for your attention.
Yate sheke she'ed Nicole Dickinson Yaneshye. Tabahe nishli nakaidene e bashachin de bele jini dashache nakaidene dashanale akatego dene astanishli. My name is Nicole Dickinson, and I come from the Water's Edge clan from the Navajo Nation and from the San Felipe Pueblo people in New Mexico. I am currently a student at Red Rocks Community College in the Trefny Honors Program, and I am pursuing my bachelor's degree in environmental engineering and water quality management. I am also a poet and an environmental activist and a mother of 3 boys. So a lot of my inspiration and motivation and drive for this is because of my boys. I just kind of want to start off with just some basic information about the Neta, or the Navajo Nation. It's approximately 27,413 miles squared, so that's like New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia combined. And we are one of the largest reservations in the country. But with that being said, 10% of our reservation is what you would call urbanized. So that means that it's very rural, maybe 2 highways that you can take, and everything else is dirt roads. Our only towns are Shiprock, Farmington, and Gallup. That's it. And they're very small. When you live in an area like that, you're not going to have very great infrastructure. One, because of funding, and because of aging out. There's a lot of people who live where there's no electricity, there's no water, so you have to drive a few hours out to a water station and haul your own water back home. And what you take is what you have to ration. Sometimes it's hard to get back to the water station depending on if you have enough gas to get there and back, because sometimes that's an issue, or the weather. Because we're on dirt roads, if it rains or if it snows and our roads are too bad, we can't go out and go get water. You learn how precious water really is to you when you have to carry your own water versus being able to turn on a tap and having that water just come to you so easily. We have a lot of different fossil fuel industries on our reservation. We have the Kayenta mine and the Navajo Generating Station. The Navajo Generating Station is one of the largest stations in the West. So the Kayenta mine, this has been going about maybe in the 70s, and the groundwater contamination from this is so severe that the elders who live on Black Mesa and Kayenta are kind of in an area where the Dene and Hopi are mixed in a certain spot. So it not only affects my tribe, but it also affects another tribe. Our groundwater is extremely contaminated, and it's forcing our elders' wells to be closed off. They cannot grow their crops. Their livestock are dying at alarming rates because of the water or the lack thereof. We decided to close the Kayenta mine and the Navajo generating station to transition to solar. So we're going to have a solar facility. So with that, we got the government to work with us, which sometimes is really hard, being a sovereign nation, to be able to have certain legalities and cooperation to where we can get things done jointly. So there's going to be what is called the Promise Act that an Arizona congressman presented. So what this is going to be a revenue replacement for those who worked at the Kayenta mine or at the Navajo generating station. So that way it helps out our economy just for a bit. Like the Hopi, 80% of their revenue depends on the mine versus the Ned, like it's 23%. So we're a little bit bigger, so this will at least be able to help kind of buffer that, so that way we can keep ourselves sustainable economic-wise until we actually get the solar power plant going. And then another thing that we have from the 1940s to the 1980s, there was a huge uranium mining boom on the Navajo reservation. Now, currently, there are 520 abandoned mines on our lands. This is also, again, contaminating our groundwater in different areas, and they're scattered throughout the whole reservation. And again, if the reservation is the size of New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia combined, that's a lot of additional contamination to our water. With that, there were a lot of wells prior to the EPA coming out and assisting us with testing uranium levels and things like that. There were wells that were not marked or anything, and people were drawing from the wells, for home and their crops and livestock. So now we have a really huge issue with birth defects, even 2-3 generations down the line. We're still dealing with that. Cancer is a really huge thing right now. It's kind of difficult to be able to get enough resources to be able to assist with that while we're dealing with cleanup and things like that. We all need water, right? So if we don't have water, we don't have anything. We have a teaching. The word is honjon. Honjon means that everything is connected. All the atoms to everything to the universe, we're all connected. One of the things that I was taught, and that's sort of universally taught throughout different tribes, is that water is sacred. Because one, everything's connected, but also we come from water. When we are in our mother's wombs, we come from that water of life. And this water here, it gives life to everything else. And for us to be able to continue to take care of the water the way that it needs to be, or in preventative manners, will definitely, hopefully, lead to a better outcome. A lot of the tribes have been dealing with environmental and water impact devastations for a very long time on our own land. So we're kind of like on ground zero as far as this goes, and trying to figure out how to clean our water, maintain our infrastructure. I'm hoping that we can raise enough awareness to where we can show the rest of the country that there's other things that can be done preventatively, so that way the rest of the country doesn't end up in the same situation that we're in. There are a lot of different grassroots coalition and water protector camps that are going on, that have been going on. I'm sure that some of you have heard of Standing Rock that happened in 2016. We have to take matters into our own hands now. We have tried to work in different ways with the government, with different fossil fuel industries, so that way it can be done in a way that is agreeable for everybody within the plan of a pipeline or a mine. It's not changing, it's not getting better. So at this point, it's really up to us on our lands. But we share water with a lot of other places. The Gold King mine spill just a few years back affected the Colorado River watershed, the Animas River, and the San Juan River. That not only affected 4 different tribes, it also affected everybody else downstream. I feel like taking matters into our own hands, and again, as it was mentioned, you have to know where your money is being put into. Because a lot of the times, these corporations and these fossil fuel companies are hand in hand. They're in cahoots, they're going to rake in that money, and that's the main point for them. A few different times, people from Greenpeace or from different water protector camps where they have tried to do things to show people or get attention to divest your money from those banks and the corporations in order to stop the flow for those projects. My whole reasoning behind all of this and why this is my focus, like I said before, I have 3 boys who are 15, 13, and 10. Prior to me starting school, I kind of thought, well, they're little, I should do something with my life other than a mom, like be an example. What kind of legacy would I leave? The only thing that made sense, when you think of a legacy, sometimes you think of your work. That's your legacy, the effort that you put out into the world. And for me, what's always going to be around, sometimes they say that it takes, I think, 3-4 generations sometimes for you to be forgotten after you pass, So I'm like, okay, well, the only thing that's going to be around after I pass is going to be the earth and the water that's been around forever and is still going to be here. So I kind of went that way with it. Growing in this industry and being a student and taking on, more ways to raise awareness on the issues that we face. And I'm hoping that I can make a bigger impact, not only back home where I can help with like water reclamation and infrastructure issues, but to be able to make an impact so that way we do have water in the future. My grandma always told me that one day water will be the liquid gold and there will be wars over water. I can't look at my kids in their eyes knowing that I didn't do anything. It's my responsibility as a mother, as a future ancestor, as a indigenous Navajo woman to be able to do everything that I can and be able to assist others so that way we can continue as a species. These issues that we face on the Navajo reservation isn't anything new. It's been happening for a while, but it doesn't only happen on my reservation. The San Carlos Apache have been having issues with the Resolution copper mine since 2001, and even farther back, Standing Rock in 2016 with the Dakota Access Pipeline. In Louisiana, there's the Bayou Bridge issue going on out there. Chaco Canyon, is another thing that we're dealing with. That's a sacred site for the Pueblo and the Dene. The BLM had a land sale, and now there's going to be fracking out there. And so again, here we go with the whole water contamination. And the only thing that we were able to get the companies to agree to is a 10-mile radius around Chaco Canyon. It's a lot, Different tribes everywhere. Everywhere has some kind of water issue. And I'm really hoping that at some point we can show the rest of the world even how to act. I don't want to say we're running out of time, but we need to really get on it. Like I said, I can't stand around and say that I didn't do anything. So yeah, that's it.
I'm Betty Harris, and you can tell where I'm from. I actually grew up on a farm in Mississippi, but I have a CPA license, and I'm a certified financial planner. All of this retired. Does that make me emeritus? But I'm a community organizer, and I'm also a watercolor artist, and I teach my class on the other side of this screen 3 days a week. Besides that, I finally figured out that we're in one heck of a mess, and that as I get older, there's less that I can do. But the one thing that I can do is teach, and teach people how to survive, how to cool the planet where you live. Because I know that we can make a massive difference if everybody would do it. My family cleared land in Mississippi from the trees that had been there probably for thousands of years. And when I was a kid, they cut down these trees, and this allowed them to plant crops in fertile land or fertile soil. By the time I graduated from college, the farmers, in cahoots with the Farmers Cooperative and the county extension agents, had been taught to use heavy equipment and use chemicals, and they killed the soil. It is still dead today. I learned organic gardening by reading Organic Gardening magazine when I moved to Virginia. And then I turned a piece of red clay into a compost heap in 3 years. But when I came here in 1983, I couldn't believe what was masquerading as soil here. So I've always been an avid reader, and I have read all kinds of things. And in 2015, I took a 9-day class at the Woodbine Ecology Center, which was partly covered by a grant from the city with the agreement that I was to teach what I had learned. That fit right in with my way of doing things. Then the city insisted that I teach classes and that I feed the people so that more people would come, and then they gave me more grants to feed the people. As a part of all this, the Littleton Garden Gang was formed, where we get together to help each other with gardening issues, and we help rescue homeowners in trouble with code enforcement. We hold an annual harvest dinner in November, that's coming up, and we plant trees on Earth Day in April, and I'm trying to get everybody to plant a tree on your birthday. 3 years ago, we planted one on January the 29th, and everybody told me you cannot plant a tree in Colorado this time of the year, but I was digging a hole and it wasn't frozen. So we did, and the tree's doing very well today, and we've continued that. And Ray and I have promised that as long as we are above ground, we're planting a tree on our birthday. We don't have that much space on our property, so we're taking applications. But I really want to show you why I do what I do. I teach members of our community to grow more with less water. But first, we have to understand what we're dealing with. So, with your permission, I will do what I always start my classes with. Okay, if you would imagine with me that this apple is our planet, watch what happens. I'm cutting it in fourths to illustrate something important, and that is that 3/4 of the planet is covered with water. Apple?
Oh, I dropped it.
Okay, well, here's a clean one. Okay. Okay. So then I have to cut this in thirds to show you something else. And try not to cut me. Okay. 1/3 of this piece that we have left is basically covered with rocks. 1/3 with ice. So we're going to grow crops on this one. But we have to do some more cutting because 1/3 is too salty. 1/3 is too infertile. So what you're left with is this to feed yourself. But there's more. Actually, we can only grow food on this little sliver, the few top inches of soil. And with this, we have to grow food to feed 10 billion people. And at the rate that we're losing farmlands every year, there's a lot of people going to starve. Okay, so how we treat this thin sliver will determine whether life on this planet and your grandchildren will survive. You see, we don't know or understand that a lot of the problem with soil is water, and that bare ground is what causes droughts. Now, those rock gardens, that's just a fancy form of bare ground. If you want water to go into the soil so that you can live and so that you can have water, you have to plant things. And I know that there are areas all over the country, the world, that are covered with hard-packed dirt where animals and things have packed it down, and when it does rain, it all runs off. But there are solutions. What we need to do is to learn how to grow food for ourselves where we are. And we have to understand that plowing, that includes your rototiller, recycle that, okay? And if we burn off plant residue, or we do the scorched earth policy and we rake all of that organic matter off and we put it in plastic bags and we give it to the trash man, okay, we're creating more CO2 problems. And when we beat that soil with the plow or your rototiller, you're killing soil animals. You know, those ooey little things that crawl around in there that are so vital to producing food. Who knew? We didn't know. From the farmland, we didn't know. So research shows that as the CO2 increases, plants are less nutritious. They have fewer vitamins, fewer proteins, and fewer essential minerals, and get this, more carbs. Our soils have lost an average of 80% of their minerals in the last century. The drop in these chemicals and minerals doesn't affect the plants as much as us because they're pretty flexible and they just store more carbs. So plants will be here when we are gone, but your low-carb diet is being killed by climate change. Speaking of climates, the current climate in the USDA inhibits research on carbon dioxide concentrations and food quality, which gets very little funding. What is learned is buried. Rather than sound the alarm about the results of a study that reveals that a crop that serves as a crucial staple for 600 million people in low-income countries worldwide is deteriorating. The USDA declined to publicize it, and they convinced the University of Washington not to, either as Politico's Helena Bottomiller reported in June. Currently, the USDA, in the USDA, there's an implicit directive not to promote agricultural research related to climate change. Now, more severe weather blocks our ability to feed ourselves. And since we can't stop those massive droughts and floods, we have to figure a way around these issues. We can manage the piece of ground that you live on. That's the piece you can control. And it's imperative that we do what we need to do for that little bit of property. And we really must, because high-intensity commercial agriculture kills the soil. There's a man named Alan Savory who's a wildlife ecologist, an expert in holistic land management, and he learned the hard way how not to manage land. He worked to solve some drought issues in Africa, where knowledgeable people, including himself, decided that elephants were causing the droughts by eating the plants. So to solve the problem, they killed some 40,000 elephants before it came to them that they were making it worse. So he now teaches people in Africa and around the globe a sustainable method of managing land by, get this, adding animals to the landscape. It's called holistic management. And since 2/3 of the world's tillable land is desert, we got to get on with it. He says that it's not the lack of rain that causes deserts to form, but bare ground causes it. And we get bare ground from improper management of it and from animals, but not enough animals. We're not helpless victims of the varying lack of rain. The lessons that they learned in Africa can be applied here and around the world. Since the predictions are that the southwest U.S., that includes us, is going to suffer from a decades-long drought that's worse than that which drove the Pueblo Indians out of the Four Corners region, we need to apply what others have learned to what we do here and now. And if you want to learn more about what that includes, you can take my free gardening class, which includes lunch. While we can't change what goes on in the USDA or big agriculture, we can change what goes on in our own yards. We can't change how much or how little water we get, but we can change how we store it. Now, don't give me that thing about the 2 55-gallon drums of water. We'll talk about that later. But we can change how we store water, just as the Africans are stopping the advance of the Sahara Desert by planting what is being called the Great Green Wall across the continent below the Sahara. And some of them are breaking with tradition, because there's only one way you can do things. You know, we've always done it that way. We have to do it that way. But they're breaking with tradition to make it possible to live in their own area. Whether you want to save a farm or a planet, you have to think outside the box that big agriculture has put us in. You have to learn how to grow more with less water, how to cool your corner of the planet, how to feed the pollinators, and how to work less as it gets too hot to work outside. I'm a lazy gardener. That is what I teach you in my classes, which are free and includes lunch, as I mentioned. I do this because I want your grandchildren to have a fighting chance to survive. I'm not having any, so I'm concerned about yours, okay? But you have to be willing to change what you do with the land that's beneath you. So take my classes, work with other members of the community called the Littleton Garden Gang, build a better community, save your corner of the planet. So if you want to join the garden gang, you take my class, you put your name on the form that's in the back, and everybody who's in the garden gang stand up so they can say hello.
Oh, hello.
So we can choose to act, or we can choose to despair. What is your choice?
All right, Christine.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to speak at your panel on climate change, empowerment, and action over despair. I will share my slides now. This is, by the way, just a recording after the panel because there were some sound difficulties during that time. So I'm going to talk about, I want to share with you a spiritual perspective on how we can have a hopeful vision for our Earth and our children. All the scientific evidence of climate change and human actions and inaction would speak against hope. So how can we find hope considering the reality of our world? Climate change is an existential crisis and forces us to reconsider our values and assumptions about life. Who are we human beings? And what is our purpose of living on this planet for a finite time only? These are spiritual questions that are addressed by religion. If properly put into practice, religious teachings have the potential of solving the environmental crisis. Let's have a look at some of these teachings. I will begin with a teaching that is new in religious history, the teaching that science and religion must agree. God created a human being endowed with reason, and we are called to use it. The Baha'i writings say, religion and science are the two wings upon which man's intelligence can soar into the heights, with which the human soul can progress. It is not possible to fly with one wing alone. Should a man try to fly with the wing of religion alone, he would quickly fall into the quagmire of superstition, whilst, on the other hand, with the wing of science alone, he would also make no progress but fall into the despairing slough of materialism. We seem to live in an age now where we have to defend science from the forces of corporate interests and political ideology, and religion from the forces of fanaticism and fundamentalism. It is essential that we listen to climate scientists and take action based on science. At the same time, we need the moral guidance of religion to motivate us to action and to make our actions just. In all religions, we find teachings on the stewardship of creation. One of my favorite quotations is this one from Jewish scriptures. When God created the first human being, God led them around all the trees of the Garden of Eden and said, "See my works, how beautiful and praiseworthy they are. Think of this and do not corrupt or destroy my world." We all know that poverty alleviation is a central teaching in the Christian faith and in Islam, as well as in all other religions. The first victims of climate change are the poor all over the world. Many people who are threatened by sea level rise are poor. For example, many millions of Bangladeshi citizens. Or we may think of African farmers who can no longer grow their crops because of drought and erratic precipitation. Even in the developed countries are the poor first at risk from the impacts of climate change. They will be most affected by rising food prices or by dislocation because of severe storms. Poor populations generally emit very little greenhouse gases. The parts of the world that are rich and industrialized are responsible for the huge greenhouse gas emissions that drive climate change. Therefore, climate change is a social justice issue. Another justice issue is the fate of our children and generations to come. What kind of a planet are we leaving to them? Isn't it the ultimate of unfairness that for the luxury of a few, the life of everyone else, especially of future generations, will be miserable or even impossible? Young people have been waking up to this harsh reality and are calling for climate justice. All over the world, around 7.6 million people expressed their concern this past September. All religions teach justice in very clear language. The Bible says, "What does the Lord require of you? To do justice and love kindness and walk humbly with your God." Justice is strongly linked to moderation. It is impossible to have perpetual economic growth in a finite biosphere. We need to learn to accept the limits of our planet. In the past, it was justified to consider a growing economy as desirable progress. And this still holds true for many poor people and countries of the world. However, for the rich countries and for the planet as a whole, we have reached the limits of growth. In fact, we have already surpassed them. The current capitalistic economy exploits the earth and destroys its life support systems. It also exploits many people and exacerbates the extremes of wealth and poverty. The baseline for a sustainable economy should be the carrying capacity of the earth. Baha'u'llah wrote this passage in the 19th century, but it seems to be written just for now. Whoso cleaveth to justice can, under no circumstances, transgress the limits of moderation. If carried to excess, civilization will prove as prolific a source of evil as it had been of goodness when kept within the restraints of moderation. The existential threat of climate change makes us contemplate the question, what is the true nature and purpose of the human being? Religion tells us that the essence of our being is our soul. So we are in reality spiritual beings and can only be truly happy when we are living in a spiritually meaningful life. Many people are not connected to the spiritual world and have not found a higher purpose in life. They therefore fill their inner emptiness with material things. Materialism results in excessive consumption. A major cause of global warming and other environmental problems is the production, consumption, and waste of all the stuff we are using. On a finite planet, it is no more possible to satisfy everybody's wants. The goal should be to provide for the needs of all and to improve the quality of life for everyone. The earth simply cannot sustain the level of consumption in the rich countries. Spirituality is the antidote for materialism and consumerism. A spiritual outlook can help us shift the emphasis from consumption to well-being and a meaningful life. Spiritual progress means overcoming our ego. Putting the well-being of others before our own lies at the heart of effective climate action on all levels. Baha'u'llah wrote, "Let your vision be world-embracing rather than confined to your own self." A spiritual perspective will change the way we live and what we consume, because we understand that our everyday actions affect our brothers and sisters all around the world. For example, we may choose to conserve energy and eat less beef, and to shop only what we really need, so that in the future people will have enough food to eat and live on a planet that supports human life. Climate change is a global problem and demands unified action from the local to the global level. Martin Luther King said, "Through our scientific and technological genius, we have made of this world a neighborhood, and yet we have not had the ethical commitment to make of it a brotherhood. We must all learn to live together as brothers, or we will all perish together as fools." The Earth Charter also spells out the need for the unification of humankind. The choice is ours: form a global partnership to care for Earth and one another, or risk the destruction of ourselves and the diversity of life. The essential teaching of Christ is love your neighbor. Baha'u'llah explained that in our age, our neighbors are all of humankind. We are all creatures of God. All human beings are created equal. There is only one race, the human race, and this is the age in which we must learn to live together like one family. Lester Brown said, "Recognizing the world as an ecosystem makes us all global citizens." I will end with these words by Baha'u'llah. Take pride not in love for yourselves, but in love for your fellow creatures. Glory not in love for your country, but in love for all mankind. The earth is but one country, and mankind its citizens. True religion has the power to change hearts. Interfaith collaboration engenders realistic hope because our hearts will work together for climate justice. Thank you very much for listening.